Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here. My name is Asa Burke. I'm the president of Rasher Christi here at Georgia Tech. We are a student-led Christian apologetics club that started up a couple years ago. And for those of you maybe who haven't had much exposure to apologetics before, apologetics essentially is it's answering the questions that non-Christians ask about Christianity. It's looking at the truth claims of Christianity through, a theological lens, a scientific lens, and philosophical lens, and everything in between, and just kind of really looking at why we believe what we believe. And so that's what drives Rasher Christi here at Georgia Tech. And the way we have gone about that is we bring in speakers like we have tonight to give us a lot of really solid information with people who have done the research and dedicated their lives to these topics. And then we get together as students every other week and then have discussions amongst ourselves, and then we can really kind of hash out a lot of these really deep topics that you can't solve in one night. But we like to take that time as students to then come together and really talk deep about these things. So tonight, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Nabeel Qureshi. He's a former devout Muslim who was convinced of the truth of Christianity and the gospel through historical reasoning and a spiritual search for God. Since his conversion, he has dedicated his life to spreading the gospel through teaching, preaching, writing, and debating. Nabeel has given lectures at universities and seminaries throughout North America, including New York University, Rutgers, the University of North Carolina, the University of Ottawa, Eastern Virginia Medical School, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Biola University. He has participated in 17 moderated public debates around North America, Europe, and Asia. His focus is on the foundations of the Christian faith and the early history and teachings of Islam. Nabeel is a member of the speaking team of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, who we have had the pleasure of partnering with for this event tonight. He holds an MD from Eastern Virginia Medical School, and an MA in Christian Apologetics from Biola University, and an MA from Duke University in Religion. And also, Nabeel's first book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, which is a lot of what you're going to be hearing tonight, him speaking on, is going to be released in January. And then also we have the pleasure of live streaming tonight's event. If you have any friends from out of town, the link is on our Facebook page, Rasher Christi at Georgia Tech. They can find that, tune in, and listen to this whole talk from there. And they can also interact on Twitter using the hashtag NabeelGT. And then they can also follow Dr. Qureshi at NA Qureshi on Twitter. So if y'all could join me in welcoming Dr. Qureshi.
Thanks, Jason. Good evening. I can, by the way, see you. I'm not on a TV screen, so let's try that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Great. My name is Nabeel Qureshi. It's an honor to be here. For those of you who are so inclined, please join me in prayer as we ask God to be here this evening. God, we ask that you would be here. God, we ask that it would be in a spirit of truth that we have our discussions. I pray that when we talk about matters of Islam and Christianity, which are so dear to people's hearts all around the world, God, I pray that we would understand that we're seeking matters of truth. And I pray that this wouldn't be something that would be a matter of fighting with other people or trying to get one up on someone, but rather I pray, God, that everything we do would be in order to seek the truth, to draw closer to our Maker, the one true Maker of this universe. And God, I pray that we would walk alongside other people, not in a spirit of adversarial dialogue, but one of truthful, open dialogue. And God, at the end of the day, I pray that in everything we do, we would please you. We pray this in your name. Amen. So, on my way here this evening, I actually looked outside and I saw that there is a prayer room right across the way from here where Muslims were engaged in salat. And I find that wonderful. I think it is great. This is one of the things that I loved about Islam when I was a practicing Muslim, was that I would pray 5 times a day. And there's a discipline in that. There's something that draws you closer to your Maker when you stop and you give time out of your day to Him, to call out to Him, to remember Him. That's one of the things I really respect about Islam. And it's something that I still like about Islam even today. It's when Muslims are ready to call upon God and to ask Him into everything they do. One of the first things I used to do when I was a Muslim before I did anything was I would recite Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. And whether or not Christians agree on the details of who God is, on what He has done, we can all agree as Christians that in Islam that is an amazing thing, to dedicate so much attention and time to one's Creator. So there are definitely beautiful aspects of Islam. We should all agree with this. Also, my sister, for example, she wears the hijab. Whenever she leaves her home, she wears a burqa. And she doesn't do that because anyone forces her to. It's because she has respect for the Islamic tradition, and she believes that it protects her from the evil looks of men as she walks around in society. And so I respect that modesty. I find that a beautiful thing. And so what I'm doing up here tonight is not trying to bash on another person's culture. I find certain aspects of Islam to be absolutely beautiful. But when I was a Muslim, I didn't necessarily understand the Christian gospel all that well. And the gospel is this. This is an amazing story. That God knows you from before the beginning of time and realizes, He knows full well that no matter how hard you try, you will not be able to break away from sin. You will sin. And since God is perfectly holy, there can be no sin in His presence. So when it comes to after one's death, it's a simple matter of can you be in His presence or can you not? And if you have any sin, you by definition can't be in God's presence because He doesn't coexist with sin. And so according to the gospel message, God has to sacrifice for the sake of sin. He has to remove it all Himself. There's nothing we can do to come up before God without sin. He has to cleanse it of us Himself. And so the message, the Christian message is God loves us so much that despite our sin, He will continue to love us. He will do what He can to save us from destroying ourselves. Even if it means His humiliation. Even if it means God is not being worshipped on the throne by angels, but rather being crucified on a cross. God is willing to do that because He loves people more than He loves His majesty. There's an amazing message in the gospel there. So there are beautiful things here in Christianity, and I hope we can understand that there are beautiful things about both faiths, and we should respect them both to that end. But the question is not what is beautiful, because what I know is that when I've talked to Muslims, when I've talked to Buddhists, when I've talked to Jews, when I've talked to Christians, generally speaking, and you can tell me if this is wrong, but generally speaking, people like what they were raised with. They like the faith that they were born with. They feel comfortable with that. At most, they'll tend towards some kind of a nominal, less devout adherence to that faith. But generally speaking, people don't leave their faith. They like what they were raised with. So the question is not what do we like. The question is not what is it that we think sounds beautiful. The question is what's true. What's true? Because at the end of the day, ultimately, Muslims believe and Christians believe that there is one God. And only one God. And Muslims believe that there are certain things you must do to go to heaven, and Christians believe that there are certain things you must have faith in order to go to heaven, and the two don't coincide. Islam is an exclusivist faith, and so is Christianity, and both cannot be true. So the question is, which one is true? Now I'll tell you this, from a very young age, I absolutely loved Islam. I adored it, just like I said, and my parents taught me to adhere to Islam to the best of my ability. To give you an example of how I used to live my Muslim life as a child, my parents had taught me by the age of 5 the last 7 chapters of the Quran by memory so that I could recite them during my 5 daily prayers. Regularly, I recited portions of the Quran every single day. Not only that, but we would also recite various prayers throughout the day before starting something like I recited earlier, or even upon waking up. First thing in the morning, before my feet have hit the ground, my parents taught me to recite a prayer. Alhamdulillahilladhi ahyana ba'dama amatana wa alayhin nushur. Thanking God for giving me life every single day. Thanking God that He's the one who's given me life and He causes me to die and He causes me to rise up again. A foreshadow of the resurrection, the day of resurrection, which all Muslims believe in, but also a daily thanks to God for waking me up every single morning. Because I have no say in whether I'm going to wake up in the morning or not. Thank you, Allah, for waking me up every morning. This is the type of prayer that we prayed, and I loved it. And as I went out through my day, I would practice Islam absolutely as best as I could. I absolutely loved it. But when I got to college, I met a Christian who was able to start defending Christianity. Now, I had believed from a very young age that there's no way you can defend Christianity. I believed that the Bible had been corrupted. I believed that Jesus never claimed to be God, and the Quran says so. In chapter 5, verse 72, the Quran makes it very clear. Chapter 5, verse 116 as well. The Quran makes it very clear that Jesus is not God. He never claimed to be God. That's something that people invented after He left. Surah Al-Ma'idah is very clear on this. I also believed as a Muslim in Surah An-Nisa, verse 157, chapter 4, verse 157 of the Quran. وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. Jesus was not killed on the cross, nor was he crucified, but so it appeared to them. Jesus didn't die on the cross, Islam teaches. He wasn't crucified. So he's not God. He wasn't crucified on the cross. And surely, if he wasn't crucified, he didn't raise from the dead. So Islam denies these things about Jesus, but Christianity, not only does Christianity affirm those very three things, but it says that you must believe them in order to be saved. Chapter 10 of Romans, verse 9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now work with me for just a moment here. The Quran says Jesus did not die on the cross. He is not God, therefore he is not risen from the dead. Christianity teaches he did die on the cross. He did claim to be God, and he did rise from the dead. Notice then, it's not feasible to say all religions are true. We're making truth claims here about a man who existed in the first century, Jesus Christ. Islam and Christianity is laying claim to him. And Islam saying he did not do certain things, Christianity is saying he did do certain things. Let us have no pretenses about both being true in these matters. One of them is true and one of them is not. Now the foundational claims for Christianity are exactly those claims. Notice the statement here was, if you wish to be saved, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So these are central matters to Christianity. In fact, I believe that these are the very three matters that determine whether or not you are a Christian. Do you believe that Jesus is Lord? And chapter 10 of Romans defines very clearly Lord as Yahweh, God himself, not just some leader to follow, but God. Do you believe Jesus is God? Number two, do you believe he died on the cross for your sins and then rose from the dead? If you do, you're a Christian, as far as I'm concerned. If you believe in multiple gods, if you believe in three gods, or who knows how many gods, a pantheon of gods, you're not Christian. Because by definition, you don't believe in Yahweh anymore. You're not a monotheist. Now, Islam doesn't have the same core sets of beliefs. It has different beliefs. Now, where do we go for Islam's core set of beliefs? You can hear it every single day, 5 times a day, called from every minaret. You can hear it every time someone converts to Islam. The Shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. By saying this, if someone says it with niyyah, with intention to convert to Islam, then they are a Muslim. So this is what you need to say if you want to be a Muslim. And basically, this is what Muslims hear as soon as they're born. When I was born, which was a wonderful day, just ask my parents. When I was born, my father first recited into my ear the adhan, which starts with the takbir, Allahu Akbar, and then it continues, Ashhadu la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah, which is essentially the Shahada. It was the first thing I ever heard in my entire life. And my parents and my imams, they all taught me that when I die, or as I'm dying, I should recite the Shahada again, so that angels will usher me into heaven. And many, many Muslims recite the Shahada as they're on their deathbed. So literally, their lives are encompassed by the proclamation, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. This is the core claim to Islam. And Muhammad said in Sunan Abu Dawud, he said that any man who recites La ilaha illallah, he is a Muslim, and you are not to excommunicate him from Islam no matter what. So, these are the core beliefs of Christianity, Jesus' lordship, his deity, and his resurrection, and the core beliefs of Islam. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. So as a young college student, I set out to determine which of these is true. Which of these two faiths, if either, is true? Because, let's face it again, maybe both of them are false. Maybe neither of these two religions is true. Maybe it's something else. But it's interesting that relatively speaking, Islam and Christianity, the two most adhered to faiths in this world, have relatively verifiable claims. What do I mean by that? Relatively speaking, we can take a look at the historical events into the first century to see if these claims about Jesus are true. Did he die on the cross or not? And in fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 and 17, Paul says very clearly, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain. Some of you know this verse. If Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain. He also says, if Jesus is not risen, we of all are most to be pitied. In other words, Christians who believe that Jesus rose from the dead, if Jesus didn't actually rise, people should take pity on us because we're believing a lie. We have faith in a falsehood. So this is something that, if it did not happen, Christianity falls flat. And it's false. Also, did Jesus claim to be God or not? Important matter, extremely important matter. Because based on the view of the gospel, Christian soteriology, Jesus must be God in order to pay for the sins of mankind. It doesn't work for a man to die on the cross and pay for the sins of all mankind. That doesn't make any sense at all. That's like me walking up to Obama and saying, "Hey, Obama, I realize that the government debt is 17 trillion, but let me give you my bank account and we'll call it square." It doesn't work, because that doesn't pay for the trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. And similarly with Jesus, if he was just a man, his death would not pay for the lives of the billions and billions of people on earth who have sinned. But if Jesus is God, all of a sudden God, well, his bank account's infinite. He can pay for anything, infinitely times over. So whether or not Jesus is God is very important. Now, how can we test whether or not Jesus is God? This is an important question. Don't forget, as a Muslim, this was one of the things that really, really mattered to me. Is Jesus God or not? Because if he is, the Quran is wrong. And I never believed it was possible the Quran could be wrong. So obviously he did not claim to be God. Now, how do we know whether someone is God when they claim to be God? So coming from more of an agnostic position for just a moment, if some man walks into a room and claims to be God, now I went to medical school, I saw people walk into the hospital and claim to be God all the time. This was normal, and I would say to them, "Well, good for you, we have a room for you. Just come on in, it's padded, it's locked, you'll love it." It's normal for people to claim to be God. Usually they're hallucinating or they're delusional, whatever it is. Now, if one of them says to me, "No, Nabeel, listen, I am God, and they're going to kill me. And 3 days after I die, to prove to you what I am saying, I will raise myself from the dead." Now we have something to watch. Now we have something to verify this on. Because if someone dies and rises from the dead, then I'm going to listen to what they have to say, especially if they prophesied that. And if there's anyone I'm going to listen to about the afterlife, it's the person who's been to the afterlife and has come back. Now, where does Jesus say this, by the way? This is in the book of Matthew. People ask Jesus to show them a sign. Now, keep in mind, Jesus has just done an exorcism. He's shown them something miraculous. So when they ask him for a sign, he basically is implying, "Didn't you just see what I did?" But his response to them is, "An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. I'm not going to give you any sign except for the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth." In other words, in order to prove to you what I'm saying, you're asking me for a sign, I'll show you one sign. I will be dead in a grave for 3 days, in Sheol, in the heart of the earth for 3 days. And then I'll come out. Just as Jonah came out of that whale, I will come out from that grave. That's his claim to prove that Christianity is true. And can we see why then the resurrection is so important to the Christian faith? Can we see why then we have to see whether this actually happened? We have to investigate the evidence. It's our duty. As 21st century, historically minded people from the West, we're not people who just generally believe what we're told. We're skeptical about pretty much everything. And so it's our duty, if we're going to believe this, to have a reason for the belief that we have. And in fact, the Bible tells us to have a reason for the hope that lies within us. That's 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. If anyone says to you, we're supposed to believe these things on faith, they have not understood the biblical term faith. The biblical term faith is trust. And basically the type of faith that Christians are called to have is a faith in someone they know. In other words, you're supposed to know God. You're supposed to know what He's done and then have faith. You're supposed to trust that He will stay true to His promises. And to give you a quick example of that with my wife, if she is ever away from me, I trust that she's being loyal to me. Not because I have no evidence, but because I know who she is. I have faith in her because I've seen her, I've known her, I've walked with her, I've seen her loyalty. I have good reason to believe she will stay true to her promises, so I have faith in her. Same with God. We're not just supposed to randomly believe what preachers tell us. We should ask them, what good reason do we have to believe what you're saying? That's why the Bible says, test the spirits. We're not supposed to randomly believe things. When we have good reason to believe in someone, then we have faith in that person because of those good reasons. That's the faith we're called to have. So the Christian faith is based on the fact that we have good reasons to believe the core claims. Jesus died on the cross. He rose from the dead. He claimed to be God. Now with Islam then, how do we investigate Islam? I investigated Islam after 3 years of investigating Christianity. I investigated the historical method first. This is all while I was in the university and in medical school. I decided to learn how to study history, and I would meet with historians and I'd ask them, how does one study history? How can one know when something is true or not? And they would teach me various criteria of the historical method. And we can go into details on the criteria for the historical method if you'd like. We can do that on the Q&A. But I'll essentially end just by telling you this. The way we look into history is we look at the earliest, most reliable sources regarding that event or that person that we're investigating. We determine what the biases are, because keep in mind, every single work is biased. Regardless of whether it's a newspaper, which we often see as relatively unbiased, that's false, it's biased. Or if it's a personal testimony about someone's friend, that's also biased. Everything has biases and angles. So we got to see what's the earliest, most reliable source that discusses an event, determine what its biases are, whether we can see past those, how reliable it is, and then draw our conclusions. So, with Islam, what were the two things that I decided to look at? Well, the Shahada is La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. There's two things there. There's Allah and there's Muhammad. So how can we take a look into Allah and how can we take a look into Muhammad? Well, the first, I would say, is the Quran. You go to the Quran to see what Allah is like, who He is, what His claims are. And as a Muslim, I offered a few arguments that the Quran is divinely inspired. And there are other arguments that people use that I didn't use, which we will also take a look at briefly tonight. And the other sets of arguments I used was on Muhammad. I believed, having been raised as a Muslim, that Muhammad was the best man who ever walked this earth. Al-Insan al-Kamil, the perfect man. This is the man who's the perfect exemplar. As I was taught Muhammad and I was taught Islam, Muhammad was the most peaceful man who ever lived. He's the most generous man who ever lived. He's the most loving, the most kind, the most humble. He took care of women, he took care of orphans, took care of widows. Muhammad was the best statesman. He was the best diplomat. He was the best general. It doesn't matter what epithet you throw at him. He deserves it because he's Muhammad. He's the chief of the prophets. That's what we believed. But what do the earliest sources say about Muhammad? And how reliable are those sources? We're going to take a look at that tonight. And we're going to take a look at the sources for the Quran. So I hope that gives you a good overview of what we're going to be discussing. First, let's start with Christianity. What are the sources regarding Christianity? And some of you might be even asking, Nabeel, why should I even believe Jesus is real? Why should I ever even believe that He's a man who existed? The first thing I'm going to start off by telling you is that it is incontrovertible, according to the historical principles of investigation, that a man named Jesus existed in the first century. How do we know this? We have over 40 records of Jesus' life from ancient times describing this man who is essentially a carpenter in Palestine. He didn't have much of anything. He wasn't a centrally important figure at the time, yet we have 40 sources that refer to him. You know who the emperor was at Jesus' time? Someone shout it out. Tiberius. Good. Tiberius was the emperor of Rome at that time. Now this is a man who obviously we should have a lot written about. We can expect tons and tons of records about this man, can't we? The historical records contain Tiberius' name by 10 different individuals. That's it. 10 for Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, 40 for Jesus. You can see we have excellent reason to believe that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and existed in the first century. And that's why very, very few, in fact, I could probably count it on one hand, actually, I know of two. Scholars who study the historical Jesus actually claim that Jesus never existed, and one of them is Bob Price, who most other scholars say is just not even possible what he says. So we can dismiss, just due to the reasoning and due to the lack of scholastic support, that this is actually the case. So Jesus certainly exists. Okay, what can we know about him? Well, of the scholars that study him, and keep in mind there is an entire area of historical studies called historical Jesus studies. So we have scholars who've been studying this on all sides. These aren't all Christians by any means. Actually, the most influential ones wouldn't align themselves with Orthodox Christianity. You have people like Paula Fredrickson, Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman. You have people along these lines who would say, like John Dominic Crossan, who would say that of Jesus we can know for a fact that He died on the cross. Now keep in mind, that's one of our 3 points that we're proving for Christianity, or attempting to show to determine its reliability. Did Jesus die on the cross? The scholars who study His life, regardless of whether they're atheist, Buddhist, agnostic, Hindu, Christian, it doesn't matter. They all conclude that Jesus died on the cross. Now, if I left it there, it would be an appeal to authority, and we're trying to be academically rigorous tonight, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you some of their reasons why they believe Jesus died on the cross, but we're going to keep it brief because scholars are unanimous on this issue. By the way, it's not just them. Even Muslim scholars will argue that Jesus did die on the cross. How many of you heard of Reza Aslan's book recently, Zealots, that came out this year? A few of you? Reza Aslan's a scholar who has studied the historical Jesus. And as a Muslim, he says, yes, Islam denies Jesus' death on the cross, and I am a Muslim, but I confirm that Jesus' death on the cross is historically certain. In fact, he builds his whole book off the fact that Jesus died on the cross. So even as a Muslim, he says Jesus died on the cross. So why? Why do they say this? Well, because first off, all the evidence that we have, all the records of Jesus' life, which talk about his death, indicate that he did die. If they say anything, it says that he did die on the cross under Pontius Pilate, which is why Paula Fredrickson says, if there's anything we can know about Jesus, anything at all, it's this, that he died on the cross under Pontius Pilate. If you go away from Christian records, you go to Jewish records like Josephus, we can also see in the first century that non-Christians are saying Jesus died on the cross. We go to Gentile scholars, they are also agreeing that Jesus died on the cross. And in fact, we also have some of them saying that these people believe he is risen from the dead. We'll get to that in just a moment. So we have excellent reason to believe Jesus died on the cross because all the records point to that. Plus, if you study the historical process of crucifixion, nobody ever in the entire history of the Roman process of crucifixion, no one ever survived a full Roman crucifixion. Oh, they were crucifying people by the hundreds, especially when it came time around Jesus' time, all the way till the fall of the temple. They were crucifying people by the hundreds to make a point. That if you rebel against the Romans, we will humiliate you, we will torture you, and we will destroy you and your people. And that's exactly what was happening to all the Jews who were amongst this rebellion that happened in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, in the first century AD. Not a single one of them survived the process of crucifixion. Why? Well, first there's a flogging process. And this flogging isn't light. It's not like caning. The flogging process went with a Roman flagrum. Now, if you understand what a flagrum is, it's a whip that has 6 leather cords that come off of it. And each of those leather cords has leather balls at the end with shards of bone and metal dumbbells. As a person would be whipped, this whip was designed to cause extreme vasodilation on the skin. You have those metal dumbbells there for that reason, to bring the blood vessels, to bring lots of blood to the fore, to bring pain receptors to the surface. And then those bones, those shards of bones would latch into the skin and rip it off. So you would bleed more blood than you otherwise would. That's how this whip was designed. Oh, this whole process of crucifixion was designed to be as painful, as torturous as possible. Cicero, I believe it was Cicero, who said that let no Roman citizen even think or hear the word crucifixion. And Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified. This was reserved for the most treacherous criminals. Not a common criminal, the worst criminal. It was also said that arteries and veins were laid bare during the process of the crucifixion. Of the flogging. That people's intestines often fell out because their abdominal wall was ripped open. This was horrific, and people often died during the flogging process. It's called the pre-death for that very reason. And in the case of Jesus, we know that something happened. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus was flogged more than normal because Pilate wanted to bring Jesus back in front of the crowd and say, look, we've flogged him. Do you still want to crucify him? We've punished him. And they say, no, crucify him. It would stand to reason that he flogged him more than they thought they would in order for him to say, okay, let's go ahead and release him. But they said, no, let's crucify him. Let's move on for just a moment. This process of flogging would often leave someone devoid of skin. Their skin would be falling off in ribbons. As they're carrying the cross, they're not carrying it with a loincloth on, with skin on their body. No, their skin's hanging off in tatters. And they're naked, made to parade through a group of people. And once they're finally nailed on the cross, they're nailed through the interosseous space here between the radius and the ulna. It's because that is where the force of the weight could be held. If someone was nailed through the hands would just rip and someone would die that way. The reason why it says hands in some places is because in those times they referred to this whole area as hands. They're nailed through here, right through the median nerve. the major sensory motor nerve of the hand. If you are nailed through that place, you immediately lose all use and sensation of your hand. Then you're nailed through your feet. A 7-inch nail goes through both your feet. Why? Because if someone were just to hang on the cross, they would have no way to breathe out. As they sink back down, they'd breathe in and they'd have to push to breathe out. Well, what are they going to push against? A nail through their feet. It's to prolong the torture. It's to prolong the death. And when they finally wanted to kill you, they'd break your knees so that you couldn't push up anymore and you'd asphyxiate and die. Or they would stake a spear through your heart. That was a way to be sure that you'd be dead. Or they'd crush your skull with a hammer. Or they'd light your body on fire. Or they'd take your body and feed you to dogs. They were going to make absolutely sure that you died. That was the whole point. And no one in all of Roman history survived a full crucifixion. So we have excellent reason to believe Jesus died on the cross. Did he rise from the dead? This is an important matter. And lots of historians say we cannot investigate the resurrection because that's not a historical matter. That's a supernatural matter. And you can't study supernatural matters. Well, that's jumping the gun just a bit. If every explanation that is naturalistic falls short and falls very short of explaining what happened, then we have reason to believe that something supernatural may have happened. If there simply is no good explanation, naturalistically speaking, we can use the historical process of investigation to conclude that quite likely maybe something supernatural happened here. So what happened when Jesus died? Shortly after his death, we take a look at what happened, and those historical scholars we've already referred to, in general, agree with 3 facts that are considered relatively incontrovertible. And I'm giving you what's called the minimal facts argument, if you want to look into this. It's called the minimal facts argument, primarily promoted by a man named Gary Habermas, who's written a book called The Historical Jesus. Also by his protege, Michael Licona, who's written a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. He wrote it alongside Gary Habermas. And he's also written his manifesto, a rather large book that serves well for curing insomnia. He's written that as well. Sorry, Mike. He's written that as well. And if you want to look at a very thorough investigation of the historical method on whether or not Jesus died, I suggest you take a look at this book published by Erdman's. Michael Licona is the author. The argument runs as follows. Pretty much every scholar who studies this, at least a vast majority, if not virtually all scholars, conclude 3 things happened after Jesus died. Well, number 1, the first one is that Jesus did die on the cross, which we just looked at. Number 2, that the disciples, Jesus' disciples, all believed he had risen from the dead. Now get me right here. That doesn't mean he did just because they believed it, but it means they did sincerely believe it. They went to their death believing Jesus died and rose and appeared to them. So it's that belief that we're holding on to. Not necessarily that he did, but they sincerely believed he had risen from the dead. And why do they conclude that, by the way? All the disciples ran away from Jesus. When he was arrested, they were fearful. They didn't know what was going on. Even Thomas, who was willing to go to his death for Jesus, when Jesus was arrested, they all ran away. Of course, we know John watched the crucifixion, and we do know that Peter came to the trial scene, but at least at that time, they all ran away. However, after the resurrection, these men were willing to go to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. These men were willing to die for the fact that this man had risen. Again, that doesn't mean he had actually risen, that we're not there yet. But it does mean they sincerely believed it, because liars make poor martyrs. People aren't going to die for a lie or something that they know is false. Of course, people die for things that are false all the time, but not things that they know are false. So, the disciples truly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, and according to most historical Jesus scholarship, Christianity wouldn't have gotten off the ground if it weren't for that fact. Fact number 3. Fact number 1 was Jesus died on the cross. Fact number 2, the disciples truly believed he had risen from the dead. Fact number 3, people who were enemies of Jesus, or not his disciples, also believed he had risen from the dead. Now, who are we talking about? We're talking specifically about 2 people, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, as it were. James, the brother of Jesus, did not follow Jesus during his lifetime. We see in the book of Mark that Jesus' family comes up and says to people around Jesus that he is out of his mind, basically, that he's crazy, which is what leads Jesus to say, "Who is my mother and brother and sister?" It's those who do the will of God. So Jesus' family is not on his side. It wasn't until after the resurrection, or supposedly the resurrection, when all of a sudden the disciple James becomes the brother of Jesus, James, becomes a leader of the Christian church. And also Saul of Tarsus. Who is this Saul guy? Saul was the student of Gamaliel, one of the chief leaders of the Jews in the time. This man was primed and groomed to be a leader of Jews, a leader of Pharisees. He was going to have all kinds of power in the temple. He already had all kinds of power because he was able to deliver people to prison. He was given special permission to hunt Christians down. Yet this man was willing to go to his death over and over and over again for something. For what? He claims it was because he has seen the risen Jesus. Now, let's stop and think for just a second. We've got these three facts that, again, virtually every scholar agrees with who studies the historical Jesus. How do we account for these three facts? Well, let's put the resurrection aside for a bit. What is the most common alternative hypothesis for the resurrection of Jesus? Number one, it's that the disciples hallucinated Jesus. They hallucinated his return. And the argument goes as follows. People who have followed a man like Jesus, their spiritual leader, for years and years and years, they've grown to love him. Of course we can expect them to see the risen Jesus after he dies. They hallucinated him. They loved him so much he returned to them, at least in their eyes. And we know that people today, and this part is true, we know that people today often see their loved ones after they died. That must have happened with Jesus' disciples. They saw Jesus after he died. Okay, let's take a look at that hypothesis for just a minute. The earliest records of Jesus' resurrection say that 500 people saw him risen at the same time. Now, what am I talking about? I'm going to explain this briefly because I want you to have the evidence before you so you know what we're talking about. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. Yes, they're written by Paul. And Paul wrote 1 Corinthians probably towards the end of the 40s AD or the beginning of the 50s AD. But here's what a group of, when I say non-Christian, I mean non-Orthodox Christian scholars have claimed. This is the Jesus Seminar. Many of these people call themselves atheists and agnostics. None of them is really a friend to traditional Christianity. Here's what they argue. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, comes from a formulation that arose 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. Stop and think for just a moment. What from all of history comes that quickly? The first biography of Alexander the Great that we consider substantial comes 300 to 400 years after Alexander died. 300 to 400 years after Alexander died. This is 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death? Nothing in history comes that fast. In fact, one scholar who's even more respected than many of the Jesus Seminar scholars is a man by the name of James D.G. Dunn. And in his book, Jesus Remembered, James D.G. Dunn is a professor emeritus out of Durham University in the UK. In his book, Jesus Remembered, he says that this formulation came within months after Jesus' death. So he dies at the Passover before the end of the year. People have already formulated the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to Peter and James and the 12 and then to the 500. All of that is formulated within months after Jesus' death. This is history at its finest, even according to the Jesus Seminar, non-Christian scholars. So you have the fact that 500 people saw Jesus risen at the same time. Can we really have a mass hallucination? That's like inventing a miracle to avoid a miracle. There is no such thing as a mass hallucination. So this theory that the hallucination theory is a good one, it just doesn't fit the facts. But the fact it really doesn't fit is that third fact. Why in the world would Paul have hallucinated the return of Jesus? He had no psychological phenomenon that would explain this. He hadn't followed Jesus for 3 years. He hadn't given his life to Jesus, as it were. Yet even Paul is willing to go to his death because Jesus is risen. So, this theory simply does not fit the three facts that pretty much all scholars will grant. What's the next most common theory? The next most common theory, instead of the resurrection, is that Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples. Well, again, that doesn't explain why Paul saw the risen Jesus. And it doesn't explain why the disciples would have gone to their death proclaiming the risen Jesus. They don't die for a lie. They honestly believe this. So the theory that fits the facts the best, and after that, by the way, you start getting to some other theories like Jesus had a twin that no one knew about who came right at that time. Then we get to the super alien theory. I mean, it gets really fanciful after that. So none of the arguments explains the facts as well as the resurrection. So what is the claim that I'm making? Is it historically certain that Jesus rose from the dead? That's not the claim I'm making. The claim I'm making is that Jesus' resurrection is historically the most responsible claim. It is by far the one that fits the facts the best. That's my claim. So number one, we've looked at Jesus' death on the cross. Number two, we've looked at the fact that it's reasonable to believe, and far the most reasonable thing, to believe that he rose from the dead. What about number three? This was the one that mattered to me most as a Muslim. Did Jesus claim to be God or not? Well, the first thing we have to look at are what are the reliable sources regarding Jesus' life? What sources do we have that we can look at which are relatively reliable? I'm going to quote a scholar for you. This is one that a lot of my Muslim friends enjoy quoting. His name is Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman was my professor when I studied at UNC, and he is well known as someone who challenges the traditional Christian claims. Bart Ehrman has said that if you want to study the historical Jesus, you have to go to the 4 canonical Gospels. You have to. There's nowhere else to turn that comes remotely close. Why does he say that? Because the 4 canonical Gospels are the earliest records of Jesus' life. It'd be like going to, taking an interview if there was a traffic accident and you go to talk to people who were at the scene of the accident immediately, right after the accident happened. What happened? Tell me what happened. Who hit who was driving, what was going on, give me the details. Or waiting 4 months, calling those very same people in and saying, what happened 4 months ago at that traffic accident? Who hit who? Tell me what happened. Of course, the more reliable stories are the ones that are taken immediately. The earliest ones are better. We all know this. And there is no gospel that comes anywhere close, or no account of Jesus' life that comes anywhere close to the historical proximity as the 4 Gospels. We can talk about the dating of the Gospels if you'd like during the Q&A session. I'm going to give you the critical datings of the Gospel. I'm not going to give you the Christian datings. I'm going to give you the critical datings of the Gospels. Mark's Gospel comes first, approximately 70 AD. Matthew and Luke come next, approximately 80 to 90. 80, 85 is Matthew, 85 to 90 is Luke. And then John's Gospel comes last, 90 to 100 AD. Now, hear me. I don't agree with these dates. I think that they're very tenuous. I don't think we can actually defend them, but critical scholars use those dates, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and go with those dates. If we go with Mark's Gospel being written at 70 AD, that is just 40 years away from Jesus, 4 decades. Still in the lifetime of many people who were alive at Jesus' time. Jesus, if people were 20 years old while Jesus is around, they're 60 by the time Mark's Gospel is around. And we know people lived to a ripe old age at that time. Yes, many died early, but many also lived to a ripe old age. We know Polycarp, for example, who was contemporary to that time, lived into his hundreds, or was it 90s? He lived till he was very old. And John the Elder lived till he was very old, died in Turkey. So we have people who are alive at this time. Well, what did they say? Now, generally speaking, when we turn to the 4 Gospels, historical Jesus scholars are going to leave out John's Gospel. They're going to say, we're not going to look at John's Gospel. And why is that? Because it's the last of the 4, and it looks different from the other 4. It looks fairly different, and I'll agree to that. So historical Jesus scholars don't generally look at John's Gospel. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think there's good reason to think it came early, and for those of you who are looking for a defense of the early dating of John's Gospel, please take a look at Dan Wallace's work. He argues that John's Gospel, based on the grammar found in John's Gospel, is written somewhere in the 50s or 60s. And he has good reasons to believe that, and he's not just your run-of-the-mill grammarian. He is the go-to man on Greek grammar. He's the one who's written the best-selling books on Greek syntax. So he believes we can be pretty certain, or fairly certain, that John's Gospel was written in the 50s or 60s. So I'm not agreeing that we should put John's Gospel aside, but for the sake of fair investigation, to have common ground here, let's put John's Gospel aside for a moment. And let's go to the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, to be really fair, why not just go to Mark's Gospel, the earliest of the 4 Gospels, to see if Jesus claims to be God? Because I would argue, as I did as a Muslim, that if Jesus truly claimed to be God, we would see it in the first of the 4 Gospels. We wouldn't have to wait till John's Gospel. We'd see it in the first. So what does Mark's Gospel have to say about Jesus? I'm going to distill it for you. Every time Jesus is asked who he is in a public setting, or every time someone says to Jesus, this is who you are, in a public setting, Jesus has a response. Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Even when Peter, his disciple, in Mark chapter 8 says who Jesus is, Jesus says, don't tell anyone. There's only one place in the entire Gospel of Mark that Jesus comes out and boldly proclaims who he is. Are you with me so far? Let me see some nods. Good. And not this kind of nod. Okay. There's only one place in Mark's Gospel where Jesus says clearly who he is. Now, up until then, he's been using a title for himself quite regularly. What is that title? Son of Man. Over 80 times in the Gospels, Jesus uses the term Son of Man. The first time it's found is in Mark chapter 2, verse 10. The next time it's found is in Mark chapter 2, verse 24. Throughout Mark's Gospel, Son of Man is the one where Jesus uses the title to refer to himself frequently. Now, there are 2 sons of men in the Old Testament. One found in Ezekiel and one found in the book of Daniel. Okay, these are 2 very different sons of men. The Son of Man in the book of Ezekiel is a lowly human figure. God refers to Ezekiel in the vocative every time, calling him the Son of Man. Son of Man do this, Son of Man do that. And it's to emphasize how human Ezekiel is. But then there's a Son of Man in the book of Daniel, which looks very, very different. This is a Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven. What does that mean? The only being that comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament is a divine being. In fact, God comes on the clouds of heaven in the Old Testament. So here in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13, you have one who looks like a Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. A very different Son of Man. Which one is Jesus claiming to be? Well, like I said, there's one place in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus boldly, loudly, publicly, clearly proclaims who he is. And that's Mark chapter 14, verse 62. In Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus has been asked by the high priest, who is he? Who is he? Up until this point, he hasn't been saying. This is known as the climax of Mark's gospel. This is what everything has been building to. This question, Jesus, who are you? And Jesus responds, the question is, who are you? Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus responds, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. You will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. So which Son of Man is Jesus referring to? I can hear you. Daniel. He's referring to the one in Daniel, the Son of Man who comes to the clouds of heaven. That's the one he's been talking about. Let's revisit Daniel and see what the Son of Man is about. Daniel is looking at his vision. He's having a vision, and he sees God, the Father, the Ancient of Days, being worshipped on a throne. So this is God, the Father, being worshipped on a throne, surrounded by angels. And then Daniel says something very interesting. He says, behold, verse 13, chapter 7, behold, I look in my night visions, and one like a Son of Man approached the Ancient of Days. So here's God the Father, the Ancient of Days, being worshipped by angels. One like a Son of Man came on the clouds of heaven. As only God and divine being comes, the Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven. And to him, that Son of Man, is given glory, authority, and sovereign power. Okay, so whoever this Son of Man is, it looks like a Son of Man according to Daniel. He's given glory, authority, and sovereign power. He's coming as a God into heaven. He's given glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven. Then it says, people of every nation and language served him. Stop. Who is the one who receives service in heaven? God. Or you might ask, Nabeel, what kind of service is this? Maybe it's some other kind of service. I don't know. Maybe there's tables, restaurant tables in heaven. We're all going to get served, right? What is this service? This service, according to the Bible, over 130 times this word is used in the Septuagint in the Greek New Testament. It's the word latruo. Every single time this word service is used, it's used as a word due only to God. Due only to God. No human ever receives latruo. Actually, one time a human does receive Latruo, and God curses that. He says, essentially, that is due to me. You are cursed for having received Latruo. And yet here, the one who looks like a son of man, who has glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven, came as God comes, is being served in heaven with the service due only to God by all people of every nation and language. And then it says, his kingdom is one that will not pass away, and his dominion will never be destroyed. Wait a minute. Stop. In the Old Testament, you've got God being worshipped in heaven, and then you have one who looks like a son of man being worshipped in heaven with the service due only to God in his own kingdom. No one tell me that there's no foreshadow of the Trinity in the Old Testament. It actually starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, but it's clearly found here as well. And as if Jesus needed to make his point any clearer, he then says, you will see him sitting at the right hand of the power. That Son of Man will be sitting at the right hand of the power. Well, what is this? This is a reference to Psalm 110, verse 1. In Psalm 110, verse 1, it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I will make the enemies a footstool for your feet. No one in all of Second Temple Jewish history ever claimed the right to sit next to God on his throne. Not only did no one ever claim it for themselves, no one claimed it for anyone else. Because if you were to say that, then essentially what you're saying is that God has an heir. It's like the king sitting on his throne with his son, the prince, next to him. That's what it means to sit next to God in that context. That's why Moses was never shown sitting next to God. That's why Enoch was never shown sitting next to God. Or any of the archangels. They were all shown standing next to God. Sitting next to God would be blasphemy. That would mean that they are God. Yet Jesus claims not only to be the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, whose worship with a service due only to God, but also has the right to sit next to God on the throne. He's the heir to the throne of God. Is it any surprise then why the high priests in this Inquisition opened up their robes and said, you have heard the blasphemy for himself. What shall we do? And everyone responds, crucify him. What was blasphemy at that time? Again, I'm going to defer to Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman says that it's not blasphemy to claim to be a Messiah. It's not blasphemy to tell people they're wrong. It's blasphemy to claim prerogatives due only to God. And that's what Jesus claimed. That's why he was found guilty for blasphemy. That's why he was crucified. By the way, this claim from Psalm 110, verse 1, is it historically sound? Now, I've used Mark Gospel, but I don't want to make it sound like the Bible says it, therefore it's true. Historical Jesus scholars take a look at the term Son of Man, and they say that the term Son of Man fulfills the most stringent criteria of historical investigation. And what's that criteria called? It's called the criterion of double dissimilarity. This criterion of the historical method is so selective that once it fulfills that, scholars conclude this must have been said. And I can answer questions exactly on how that works if you'd like during the Q&A. That's how strong it is, the Son of Man claim by Jesus. And what about the one that says Jesus was sitting at the right hand of the power? How strong is that? This is the Old Testament reference that's used the most in the New Testament. Over 20 times it's found in the New Testament. It permeates all sorts of letters. It permeates the Gospels. It's found by multiple authors in the New Testament. It is so woven into early Christian history we can't deny that it's at the earliest stratum. So did Jesus claim to be God? Once again, I argue that we can't ever claim certainty in these matters, but if we're going to say, what's the historically most responsible and by far most responsible conclusion? I would say yes. The evidence points to the fact, even in the earliest gospel, interwoven through all the gospels, verified by the strongest criterion of historical investigation, Jesus claimed to be God. And I realize this as a Muslim, by the way. I'm not saying this to you as a Christian having done the investigation. I was one who was still reciting the 5 daily prayers. I was one who was leading the Jummah. I was giving the Jummah khutbah. Whenever the Imam was gone, whenever my father wasn't around, I would do the Jummah khutbah, the Friday sermon at the mosque. I was the one who would do tafsir on the hadith when we had no tafsir present, commentary. My friends would bring to me hadith. They'd say, Nabeel, what does this mean? They would come to me. And I would be the one doing this as best I could. Of course, Allah knew best is what I would say. But that's as best as I could do because they were coming to me. And yet I concluded, if I'm going to be responsible here, history points to the death, resurrection, and deity of Jesus Christ. He's proved his case. Now what about Islam? Remember, these are two separate things. Now Islam does deny those things. Islam does deny Jesus died on the cross, yet it's the most historically responsible conclusion. Islam does deny the deity of Jesus Christ, but once again, it's the most historically responsible conclusion. So already, before getting off the ground, when we take a look at Islam, which comes 600 years after Jesus, 600 miles away from Jesus, what it says about Jesus is not historically sound. Could it still be true? Of course, it could still be true, but we'd have to throw out history in order for it to be true. And if we're willing to throw out the evidence, then anything could be true. But let's take a look at the claims of Islam. Remember, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, our claim for Islam is Allah, the God of this universe, as found in the Quran. And we have good reason to believe the Quran is the inspired word of God. Number two, Muhammad, is he a prophet of God or not? If I can show either of these things to be true, then I have a good reason to believe in Islam. So what does the evidence say? Let's first take a look at Muhammad's life. The first story, and I'm going to try to be as objective as possible. Please forgive me, I am just human, and I'll probably introduce some biases into what I'm saying, but I'm trying to be as objective as possible. An element of grace would be appreciated. The earliest source on Muhammad's life is Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. Okay, Ibn Ishaq, Sirat Rasulullah. Ibn Ishaq wrote somewhere around 150 years after Muhammad died. So, already, we should keep in mind that John's Gospel came about 65 to 70 years after Jesus, and scholars were throwing it out. This is twice as late. And when it comes to reliability, I would put that on a logarithmic scale. I wouldn't put it on a linear scale. This is exponentially less reliable than John's Gospel, but let's just put that aside for just one moment. That's my conclusion now, in the 21st century. But what did the people at that time say? Let me clarify for you. We don't actually have Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. What we have is a recension by a man named Ibn Hisham. So Ibn Hisham saved Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah. Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah has been lost to history. A man named Ibn Hisham saved it. And here is what Ibn Hisham says. He says, I found in Ibn Ishaq's work things that were so offensive, so impossible, that I have taken them out. What is left is those things that I have found true. So what is Ibn Hisham saying about Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah? He's saying that it is not reliable, at least in the form in which it's found, and he has had to alter it. So what we have, the earliest source that we have on Muhammad's life, 150 years after Muhammad has died, and not exactly from then, a little bit later, but let's just say it is that, is an altered version of a source that Muslims at the time, Muslim scholars at the time, found untrustworthy in parts. That's what we have to start with. Okay? So this is before we've even gotten to the hadith literature. This is still Sirah literature. We've got Sirah Maghazi happening here. Then we've got a few more. We have Ibn Sa'ad. We have a few others who happen. And then we get to the sources that Muslims consider the most reliable. Now, the most reliable source, according to Sunni Islam. Now, generally speaking, if someone says Muslim, they're referring to Sunni Muslims because 80% of Muslims around the world are Sunni. Unless someone puts a qualifier in Shia or some other denomination. Generally speaking, you're talking about Sunni beliefs. Now, 80% of Muslims believe then that a book called Sahih al-Bukhari is the most trustworthy source on Muhammad's life. Sahih al-Bukhari was collected by a man named Imam Bukhari, who wrote and died approximately 250 years after Muhammad's death. So now we're 250 years away. The next most trustworthy book is Sahih al-Muslim, written by a man named Imam Bukhari, and the two are not independent of one another. Imam Muslim was the student of Imam Bukhari, so they're not independent sources, but these are the two most reliable sources according to Muslims, Sunni Muslims. There's a lot more to this, by the way. There's hadith methodology. There's scholars who study the method of understanding hadith. They look at isnad, the train of transmission between Muhammad and the person who wrote these down, and they weigh the hadith as mutawatir or da'if or ahad, you know, the strength of the hadith. They'll say some traditions are reliable, some are not. Regardless, what we're left with is these two as the most reliable sources. Now, what do these sources say about Muhammad? I don't want to go too far in detail, because it can be offensive, it can sound like I'm trying to bash Islam. But I will tell you this, I'll tell you my conclusion, and if any of you are so bold as to ask the question over Q&A, I will answer it. Once you read Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulullah, you do not walk away with the conclusion that this man is a prophet of God. Far from it, you see some tragedies that you would say are unconscionable. And again, I can answer those questions for you in the Q&A if you'd like. When you come to Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim, same thing. I was raised believing that Islam was a religion of peace. That's why when 9/11 happened, it shook me to the core. I was just shocked when 9/11 happened. I said, how can people attack innocent human beings in the name of Allah, who is a peaceful God? That's how I was taught it. And when I started studying Islam with my own eyes, instead of with what people had taught me, I come to Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih al-Muslim, Volume 1, Book 30. Volume 1 of Sahih al-Muslim, Hadith number 30. And what it says is, Muhammad said that I will drive all Jews and Christians out of the Arabian Peninsula. No, I'm sorry, that's Sahih al-Bukhari. Sahih al-Muslim is, I will leave none alive except Muslims. I didn't believe it was true. I said that must be a weak hadith, must be false. So I went to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and they just kept piling on and on and on. All these hadith that made me think, this religion, I can't walk away from an objective perspective and say this man is a prophet of God. I can defend him as a Muslim. I can throw out these hadith and I can say, but Muhammad did it this in this context, and this happened in this context, and you can start defending him. You can take a defensive posture, that's fine. But as an objective investigator coming to the books of hadith and the books of seerah, the historical records of Islam, you do not walk away feeling like there's an objective case that Muhammad is a prophet of God. Far from it. You start seeing him as a product of the 7th century, a natural product of the 7th century. So then I turned to the Quran. And I said, where in the Quran can I find good reason to believe that the Quran is inspired by God? And there are 5 arguments that I found Muslims using most commonly, and I myself used some of these arguments, to show that the Quran is inspired of Allah. The first argument is the Quran's own argument. 5 times in the Quran, a challenge is issued, saying, if you think this book is a forgery, try to write another book like it. It doesn't matter if you call all your friends, it doesn't matter if you call jinn, which are kind of like demons, but not really. You call jinn and men alongside you and try to write something like the Quran, you will not be able to. That's the challenge the Quran gave 5 times. It's in fact the only defense. People used to come up to Muhammad and say, you are but a forger. This is recorded in the Quran. You are someone who's committing a forgery. You're just copying poems, or you're just saying poems. The Quran's challenge is, you try to recite something like this. You couldn't do it. Doesn't matter how you look at that argument, it has been answered. If you look at it methodologically, is it even an objective argument to say this is as good as that? It's too subjective in its methodology to be a real test. So it fails in its own methodology. It fails in the sense that it's trying to show something out of excellence means it's written by God. I'm not going to argue, like if I like, I don't know, if I like Kirk Cameron films, I'm not going to argue he's God because his acting is so good. I'm not going to argue that Eminem's rapping makes him divine. It's good stuff, sure, but that doesn't make him divine. So even the end point is not necessarily true. But what's more, the challenge has been met. There's a book called Al-Furqan. Al-Furqan al-Haq, I believe it's called, the True Furqan. And this is a book that was written in the past few decades, which attempts to copy Quranic style, try to write a book like it. It attempts to copy Quranic style, yet teach other doctrine. And so using Quranic orthography, using Quranic poetry and grammar, it tries to produce something like the Quran. This book has been recited in public places throughout the Islamic world, and Muslims regularly come up to those reciting it and saying thank you for having recited the Quran in public. That's how well it matches the challenge. In fact, India has found this such a devastating book that they have banned it from entry in its borders. So that the challenge has been answered methodologically in its endpoint, and also the challenge itself has been answered. It doesn't work. What's the second most common argument I see for the inspiration of the Quran? The second most common argument I see for the inspiration of the Quran is that there are scientific miracles found in the Quran. In other words, there's such advanced science found in the Quran that it could not have been written by a man who was just a man, who only had human knowledge. Either he had prophetic knowledge, thereby making Muhammad a prophet, or the Quran is inspired by Allah, and so you have the inspiration of the Quran. And the arguments that are used is, for example, the Quran has miraculous knowledge about the oceans. The Quran has miraculous knowledge about the atmosphere. The Quran has miraculous knowledge about X, Y, and Z. I believed this as a Muslim. In fact, there's a whole book published on this by a French physician named Maurice Bucaille, and it's called The Quran, the Bible and Science. And so I had that book as a Muslim, and I used to go through it, and I used to use the arguments. But by this point in my own investigation, I was in medical school, and I was able to study science, especially things like embryology, human development, in the Quran, knowing my knowledge from medical school, and testing to see whether or not they're true. And I'll give you one example. In the Quran, it gives a process of embryological development. In fact, this is one of the most popular examples used by Muslims. It's found in Maurice Bucaille's book as well. And it gives this development process. And at one point in the process, it says that this embryo, it says this clot, this leech-like substance, is then developed by God into bones, and then it is clothed by flesh, and then it becomes something entirely new. And so it's pointing to this process of embryological development. Well, the problem is, ask anybody who studied embryology, that's not how it works. You don't get first bones, then flesh, then developed into something new. You have the same embryological layer, the mesoderm, that differentiates into both muscles and bones at the same time. And so it's wrong. It's not true. And so when you have clear statements in the Quran that are shown false, you can't point to obscure ones to try to say this is somehow scientifically miraculous. If the clear ones are false, why are you pointing to obscure ones to say it's true? And if you need something more clear, the Quran says, and forgive me if this is a bit crass, I don't believe it is, but it's in the Quran, and here's what it says. It says that the sperm, a man's sperm, comes from between his backbone and his ribs. No, it does not. It doesn't really take much of a degree in medicine to prove that, but I have one, and I assure you that's not where it comes from. So, how is it that this is defended? Well, Muslims will say you have to look at one of those words, it's a feminine, the other one's masculine, and so what it's saying is that, oh, when a woman and a man get together, no. Look, when the clear statements have to be reinterpreted in order to be shown to be scientifically true, then you're not coming objectively. You're coming with the bias. And someone who comes objectively to this is not going to conclude what you conclude. And so that argument isn't enough to convince an objective observer either. The third argument that I used, and this is the last of the three that I used, there's two others that other people used, was the argument from perfect preservation, that the Quran has never been changed, is the argument. And now this is something that runs deep in the Islamic veins, because as a Muslim, I believe that the Bible had been corrupted. All right, the New Testament's corrupt, the Old Testament corrupt, it's all corrupt. The only thing Allah has guarded is the discernment. According to Surah 15, verse 9, Allah has guarded the Quran. This one has been unchanged. It's perfect. Once again, when we study the early Islamic sources, we find that to be false. I'll give you a few ways to look into that. First, you can look into it through the manuscript evidence. We've seen portions of certain manuscripts that have been published, for example, portions of the Yemeni manuscripts, the Sana'a manuscripts, and we find differences between that and the modern Quran. That's not my main point. You see palimpsests, such as Fogg's palimpsest, which contains within it writings from what seems like Ibn Mas'ud's Quran. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But that's been washed out and a different text has been written over it. That's not my main point either. My main point is that you look at the earliest Islamic records and you see Muslims, not just random Muslims, but the Muslims who had been entrusted with the protection of the Quran, arguing with each other over what goes into it and what does not. Where do we start seeing this? Well, we start seeing it in Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 6, Book 61. The entire book is a collection of how the Quran came together. In it, you see phrases like, well, I'll give you a key one first. A key one is Muhammad said, if you want to learn the Quran, go to these four men. The first person he mentions is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and then he mentions two other men, Salim and Muad, and the fourth one he mentions is Ubay ibn Ka'b. So if you want to go to the Quran, learn from these four. Two of them are Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b. Okay, so Muhammad picks them as teachers of the Quran. What else does Sahih Bukhari say? Same book of Sahih Bukhari, Volume 6, Book 61, says Ubay ibn Ka'b recites portions of the Quran that none of the rest of us recite. He's a teacher of the Quran. He recites portions of the Quran that none of the rest of us recite, and when asked not to, he says he will not leave it for anything whatsoever, because he heard it from the mouth of Muhammad. Surprising. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he's the first one Muhammad mentioned. You look at the records of what Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had in his Quran, he had 111 chapters of the Quran. Well, what does today's Quran have? 114. There's 3 chapters in today's Quran that were not included in the number one teacher Muhammad picked. What does Abdullah ibn Masud say about those 3 chapters? He says these are hadith Qudsi. These are revelations, sure, but they're not Quran. These are just prayers. What about the other guy, Ubay ibn Ka'b? What does he say? He says, Abdullah ibn Masud, you're wrong, and Uthman's Quran is wrong. It's 116 chapters. There's 2 more that should belong in here. These are the most trusted men with the teaching of the Quran, and they disagree with today's version of the Quran. The historical record points to this. The early Islamic records point to this. There's a lot more, by the way. Sahih al-Muslim actually says in hadith number 4434, I believe it is. No, I'm sorry, that's Sunan Abu Dawud. This is in Sahih al-Muslim, where it says that the reciters of Basra used to recite large sections of the Quran, but they forgot sections, out of which they remembered only this part. And they would recite portions out of large sections they had forgotten. Those are not found in the Quran today. Now, some people argue those have been abrogated. It doesn't work. For those of you who know the law of abrogation, this does not fit one of the 3 types of abrogation. It doesn't work. It's simply lost. So you have the early Muslims arguing over these things. You have records saying portions are lost. You cannot, once again, objectively conclude that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. Again, you can defend it. As a defensive position, sure, defend it all you want. And I'm not up here arguing that the theology has been changed. I'm not arguing that. I think the early Muslims did an excellent job of preserving their theology. I'm just talking about the verbatim preservation of the Quran. There's no good reason to believe that once you look at the earliest sources, unless you're coming at it from a defensive angle. The last 2 arguments that Muslims use to defend the Quran, I'm just going to mention them briefly. One is mathematical patterns. They'll say there's beautiful mathematical patterns in the Quran. And another one is that there are prophecies in the Quran. When you come right down to them, you look at those mathematical patterns, they don't add up. And when you come down to those prophecies, they're not prophetic. And we can talk about those under the Q&A time if you'd like. So, I'm going to end by saying this. As a Muslim then, I'm looking at these arguments. 3 that all need to be strongly evidenced in order for Christianity to be true, and they were. At the earliest historical records, using the strongest historical criteria. 2 arguments, either of which I needed to show in order for Islam to be true, and neither of them ended up being strong in the eyes of an objective observer. So what did I have to do? I had to make a choice. Do I follow the religion that I was raised with? Do I follow my family? Or do I dishonor them and pick something else? And for those of you who don't have a Middle Eastern or Eastern lineage, it might be hard to grasp just how difficult it is to take everything your parents have given you and throw it back in their faces, which is not what I was doing, but that's how they interpreted it. Very difficult process, so difficult that I didn't do it. I did not do it. I convinced myself that Islam was true anyway, until I couldn't bear it anymore, and I asked in prayer, Allah, and I would pray to Allah, and I'd say, Allah, who are you? Are you Jesus, or are you Allah, the God of Islam? And I asked for dreams, because that's what I was taught to do as a Muslim. I would pray istikhara, the salat that we would ask Allah to give us a dream, to tell us if something was true. So I asked God for dreams and visions. And He gave me a vision in 3 dreams, which pointed me to Christ. And I'm not here to talk about my testimony. I'm here to give you the evidence. But for those of you who are interested, this book comes out in February. You can read it there. So, in the end, I want to challenge you. No matter who you are in this room, if you're a Christian or if you're a Muslim, if you were raised by faith to believe something and you've believed it without challenging it, without testing it, I urge you, I challenge you to go talk to people who disagree with you. Let them challenge you. Study these matters for yourself, because when the winds come and the foundation shakes, if you don't have strong answers to these questions, you're going to be left without grounding. And in that time, that extremely painful time, you better believe you need a God to hold on to. And not just any God, the true God who can bear you through. So whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, whether you're neither, find the truth. Search the truth. Don't have these questions ring around in your mind and not address them. A question under the surface left will fester like an infection. And even if you don't see it, it is destroying your flesh. It is destroying you to your bones. Air those doubts. Discuss them so that you can be solid, so that you can know with certainty. And pursue God, pursue truth by all means, because God is the most beautiful, unimaginably wonderful being in this universe. And if He created you, if He gave you everything you have, I would challenge you to say you owe it to Him. to find out who he is. Or you can walk away. The choice is truly yours. Thank you.
I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say thank you, Dr. Qureshi, for coming forward with all that to us. We'll begin the Q&A now. There, you will see a mic in the center of the room. Please just form a queue behind that. And we ask, please, that you come with your question in mind already, so that you may keep it concise and so we can get as many questions in as possible. We're going to have about probably 20 to 25 minutes. So please just keep your questions brief so that, and then we're going to allow Dr. Qureshi to answer as many as possible. So you may line up at the mic at your leisure.
I don't bite. Asa. Ma'am.
Okay, so you said the first person that came.
Come closer to the mic, please, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh,
You can tilt it down, yeah.
okay, I'm close. Okay, I'm short. You said that the first person was 150 years after Muhammad was dead. Did I understand that correctly?
To be more precise, the first person whose biography we have a record of that ever existed of Muhammad's life was 150 years after Hijrah, yeah.
Okay, so not to be disrespectful, I'm totally honest in this
Sure.
question. Where did Muhammad come from? Was he a descendant of Ishmael? I mean, he just surfaced from where?
Great question. Now, whenever we talk about the historical Muhammad, we have two routes we go. One route is the traditional route, as determined by Hadith, the Muslim records, the Muslim traditions, Sira as well, and Tarikh, the Islamic history as recorded by Tabari and the like. Or we go the critical route. You have a critical historical scholarship route that uses modern Western methodology in order to determine who Muhammad actually was. The answer to your question from the traditional route is that Muhammad was an Ishmaelite, born to a man named Abdullah who died before he was born. He was born 570 AD in Mecca, and so he comes from the line of Ishmael. That's the traditional Muslim response, or Islamic response. The scholastic response by modern critical scholarship is we can't be entirely sure of where Muhammad was from. He was probably from Mecca, but we can't be sure. The records just are not strong enough and they're not uniform enough to give us these details.
So you don't know about the Ishmael part? I mean, he's a descendant, of course, I guess all basic...
Right, so like I said, under the traditional Islamic perspective, yes, Muhammad is an Ishmaelite.
Okay.
But from the critical scholastic, Western scholastic perspective, we don't know.
Okay. All right. Can I get back in line and ask another question?
Go ahead. And don't forget, I'll stick around afterwards in case you still have more. Sir.
Good evening, Dr. Qureshi. Thanks again for your talk. I, too, am a medical doctor, so I really appreciated a lot of the aspects that you brought in from the medical standpoint.
Sure.
But just in your own personal journey through all of this, was there anything during your residency, anything during your medical training that also pointed you towards the claims of Christ? Any other personal anecdotes you could think of?
There are plenty of personal anecdotes. Thank you so much, Dr. France, asking the question. There are plenty of personal anecdotes. I find that on a stage like this, if you share the personal anecdotes, they get mixed up with the historical, logical argumentation, and so people start saying, oh, you believe that because of this personal anecdote, look how weak your beliefs are. And so generally speaking, I don't bring them up. But since we've distanced ourselves from that, I'll share this. I had become a Christian by this point, so take that into account. When I was a third-year medical student, I was doing OB-GYN rotations, and we were at a high-risk facility in Norfolk, Virginia. And so we got the worst of the worst. My whole time, in my 2 months of OB-GYN rotations, I saw one family. Everyone else was single mothers or drug addicts or what have you. One night, a 15-year-old girl comes in labor. And it turns out she was not willing to have her baby. And so she had taken a significant amount of crack cocaine because she had heard that that would cause you to go into premature labor. And she did. The baby was born. And I'm sorry, this is difficult to remember. They had the baby being examined by the neonatologists, and just very small, very light, and breathing heavily, and obviously on the verge of death. And I asked what the situation was. I knew about the baby before I knew about the mother. And so I asked what the situation was. They told me. I went to see the mother, and I walked in the mother's room to ask her what had happened, because they didn't tell me all the details. And I walked in, and I saw her texting, and not a single care in the world, laughing, texting. And I asked her, what's going on? What are you concerned? Is this the right room? Is this the right baby? And she would not refer to the baby as her. She would refer to her as it. It was just something that didn't matter. Now, how does this play in? I was shocked that day, absolutely shocked at the level of apathy. In fact, I would say an anger welled up in me at the level of apathy towards this girl. And so I went and I started reading her H&P. I started reading her records, and when I found out her history, she had been abused as a child. Her family all did drugs. She didn't have a father in the picture. And I'm reading this and I say, who do I get angry at? Who am I supposed to be angry at here? Is it her? Is it the person who is supposed to be in her life and take care of her as a father? Is it the people who are supposed to protect her from? Who do I get angry at? And for the first time, I was just furious at the sin in the world. And yet, all of a sudden, I had this desire to care for this girl. Despite what she had done, despite the heinous crime that she had just committed, killing another human being in my perspective, I had this desire to care for her. And all of a sudden, it hit me. And I'm not a father yet, but it hit me that the love of a father goes beyond any sin. The love of a father who understands their child goes beyond any sin. I think about my father, who I call Abba. If I sin against Abba, it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter what I do. He would still love me. Now, the gospel message is that God is more loving than any human being we can imagine. If my father would forgive me no matter what, by definition, God has to be more loving than that. Now, in Islam, it's clear in the Quran, God does not love those who are unrighteous. This isn't something I'm making up. It's in the Quran. God does not love the sinners. And so, as you look through the Quran, you don't have unconditional love. You have love for those who perform. You have love for those who are good Muslims, but not unconditional love. And to me, that makes God less loving than a human, which I don't think is possible. And so, again, this is a personal anecdote. This is something that tied things together for me. The beauty of the gospel message is that God loves even those who sin because He understands. And that for me was powerful. Thank you so much for asking the question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nabeel, for your very logical and clear presentation. My question is, what is the Islamic view of Bukhari 6, 509 and 510, where it seems that Caliph Uthman has brought all the little pieces of scripture together, destroyed them, and has everyone sit down to write a new single holy scripture?
Great question. Okay, so the reference here is to the same book I was talking about, Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 6, Book 61, Hadith number 509 and 510. In these two hadith, they're fairly long, and you have a description of how the Quran was collected. And we talk about how essentially the hadith goes as follows. When Abu Bakr, after Abu Bakr's Quran had been collected, so first you have Muhammad. Muhammad dies, there's no one codex of the Quran. After Muhammad, there's a man named Abu Bakr who comes. Abu Bakr, after a few years, is challenged. People say to him, you should collect the Quran. He thinks it's not a good idea because Muhammad didn't do it. Then people urge him, collect the Quran into a book. And so he does. He collects it into a book. That book is given to a woman named Hafsa, ultimately. First he had it, and then it ultimately passed to Hafsa. When the third caliph, again, this is according to Sunni Islam, when the third caliph comes, Khalifa Uthman, people are arguing about the Quran again. And so Uthman gathers the Quran from Hafsa. He asks everyone to bring their manuscripts of the Quran. He collects them. He gets the same guy who wrote Abu Bakr's Quran, a man named Zayd bin Thabit. He gets him to take all these manuscripts, to write the Quran in the dialect of the Quraysh, makes 5 copies, and burns all the manuscripts. He destroys them so that there will be no variants. He provides 5. And it is recorded in early Islamic history that there were variants among those 5, but not significant ones, at least not that would affect doctrine. How do Muslims reconcile with this? Okay, let's first start with the 20% that don't agree with this hadith. They'll often say that there are errors, the Shia in particular. They'll say there are errors in this collection. Other Muslims will argue that there were people who had the Quran memorized. So you had, like Zayd bin Thabit himself was a man who was a hafiz. He was a man who had the entire Quran memorized. They'll say that the Khalifa, all four of them, had the Quran memorized. Problem is, this doesn't stand up to scrutiny. You have, even within Sahih al-Bukhari, the same book, in two separate places, it says, we left out of the Quran this verse, and we couldn't find it with anyone except with this man, Khuzaymah ibn Thabit. And so there are multiple verses in the Quran that were known by only one man. So how could it